to speak tonight about one of the most interesting characters in Newport history, Richard Morris Hunt. When you hear the name Richard Morris Hunt, what do you think of? Well, let's start here. Maybe Marble House. And if that doesn't fit the bill, maybe this place. Ochre Court. And then there's this place, the Breakers. Well, we won't be talking about any of those properties tonight. Instead, we'll be discussing a young Richard Morris Hunt before the Breakers. Hunt's life was a tale of two professional careers. We have his years as a budding architect between 1855 and 1875. It was a period when Hunt's work was less opulent and more picturesque than what followed. And we have his years as the so-called Dean of American Architects from 1875 until his death in 1895. It was a period when Hunt did his most recognized work, the grand Beaux Arts houses. On the left, we have Hunt, 1860 at the age of 33, and on the right is Hunt in 1885 in his late 50s. Here in Newport, we tend to focus on Hunt's later work, the stone mansions near Bellevue Ave. But his early work in Newport was just as important and just as interesting, if not more so. In his later years, Hunt looked back on his early work with nostalgia and hoped that it would not be forgotten. And that is our goal tonight. We want to review and remember Hunt's work in Newport before 1875. Now, in order to understand Hunt's early work, you need to know a little about Newport in the 1850s. Here's an early image of downtown Newport, probably mid-1850s. It was a transitional period. In the 1830s, Newport was coming out of the Depression brought on by the Revolutionary War. There wasn't much in the way of building activity. What we know is Bellevue Ave didn't exist, and there was no Ocean Ave. But people began to slowly rediscover Newport as a summer resort. Folks from the South were coming to Newport to escape the oppressive heat of the summer, and folks from New York were looking at Newport as an oasis from crowded conditions in the city. This led to a number of hotels being built, including Ocean House on Bellevue and Atlantic House on Pelham. Here we have Atlantic House on the left and Ocean House on the right. By the 1850s, Newport was back on the map. It was a place where people wanted to be, and it was a place where people wanted to live. In order to meet this demand, Newport needed something more than hotels, and that's where Richard Morris Hunt fits in. Hunt was born in Brattleboro, Vermont in 1827. He belonged to a prominent family. His father was a lawyer and a U.S. congressman. Here we have a photo of the Hunt family in 1848 with Richard Morris Hunt on the far left. The painting shows Hunt in 1849 at age 22 with a very dashing mustache. It was done by Thomas Couture, who trained William Morris Hunt in painting. We'll talk more about William Morris Hunt in a moment. The Hunt family was financially well off, and they often traveled to Europe. After the death of Hunt's father, the family eventually settled in Italy. Hunt studied art, but he developed an interest in architecture. In 1846, at age 19, Hunt enrolled in the École des Beaux Arts in Paris. It's this place. It was the world's leading school for drawing, painting, sculpture, and architecture. Hunt was the first American to be admitted to the School of Architecture at the École. Hunt studied at the École des Beaux Arts until 1854. This is a small sampling of his work as a student, not too shabby. Hunt also trained in the atelier, which is the apprentice system that existed at the time. He trained in the atelier of the French architect Hector Lefeuille. Lefeuille was given a commission to build the additions to the Louvre in the 1850s, and he assigned Hunt to work on the drawings for the Pavillon de la Bibliothèque. And here we see the result of Hunt's efforts. How would you like that on your resume as a young architect? I worked on the Louvre, and that's where he began. Hunt then returned to the U.S., where he settled in New York City and opened his own architectural studio. Business was brisk, and Hunt's career began to take off. Hunt practiced in New York City for the next several years, and then fate intervened. Hunt's brother was the painter William Morris Hunt, and here is a self-portrait of William. In 1856, William purchased a house in Newport called Hilltop Cottage. It's this place. The house is located at the top of Bellevue, roughly where the Hotel Viking is today. William had an art studio at the property where he taught the likes of Henry James and John Lafarge. Richard often visited Newport to see his brother and to connect with clients. On one occasion in 1860, Richard was taking a stroll down Bellevue near the Atlantic Hotel, and that's when he met Catherine Howland, the daughter of a wealthy New York shipping merchant. The two fell in love and were married in 1861. Here is a painting of Catherine by William Morris Hunt holding her son. That baby grew up to be the noted architect Richard Howland Hunt. He's the fellow who designed the tea house at the Marble House. In 1864, Richard purchased Hilltop from his brother. He and Catherine then lived together at Hilltop until his death. Hunt also purchased his brother's art studio, which was also at that location. He converted the art studio to an architectural studio. This is a 1939 painting of the building by the local artist Marjorie Wilson. In 1911, the studio became the first home of the Art Association of Newport before the Art Association moved to the Griswold House. The building was unfortunately demolished in 1952. It's now a parking lot for the Hotel Viking. And here are photos of the studio taken in 1890. This would have been on the upper level of the building that I just showed you. Wouldn't you love to know what plans are sitting on those drafting tables? If you look closely at the photo on the right, you'll see an interesting sculpture. This fellow here. Keep that in mind. We'll talk a bit more about that sculpture in a bit. We'll see it again. So, let's take a closer look at Hunt's career in those early years. Hunt was the architect for 24 projects in Newport between 1860 and 1875. Some involved the renovation of an existing house, while others involved new construction. 12 of those buildings still exist in some form. 12 have been demolished. We'll be looking at all 24 buildings tonight. We've got a lot of ground to cover. So without further ado, I give you Richard Morris Hunt's first project in Newport. Not the Griswold House, but Ochre Point. This may get a bit confusing. There is an Ochre Point that was built by McKim, Mead & White in the 1880s. This isn't that Ochre Point. This house was built in the 1830s for William Beach Lawrence. Lawrence was a diplomat living in New York City. He knew that his young tailor, Alfred Smith, was originally from Middletown, and so he solicited Smith's advice on where to purchase property. Smith recommended Ochre Point Farm, and based on that advice, Lawrence purchased 60 acres for $12,000. He then built a modest Greek Revival house called Ochre Point. Hunt handled the renovation of that house in 1860. It's not clear what Hunt added to the house, but I wonder if he's responsible for the addition that you see on the back. After Lawrence died, the property was subdivided. Portions were sold to the Van Allen family and the Lorillard family. Here's an aerial view of where Ochre Point was located. The house was demolished to make way for Vinland. And of course, this is Vinland, the house built by Catherine Lorillard Wolfe in 1882. Hunt's next project in Newport was the home of Arthur Bronson. In the late 1850s, the area now known as Ocean Ave was undeveloped farmland. Alfred Smith is that fellow again. He led an effort to connect Bellevue Ave to Harrison Ave by a road along the southern route. If you build it, they will come, and so they did. Bronson was among the first. He came from a New York family that had made a fortune speculating in real estate. He hired Hunt in 1860 to build a house near Castle Hill. The resulting house is not the most attractive Hunt design. I guess it's best described as a Second Empire house with a mansard roof and a projecting bay on the front. Second Empire was popular at the time, so I suspect that Bronson had a lot to do with what the house eventually looked like. Hunt had a very simple philosophy when it came to implementing what his clients wanted. He once said, "It's your client's money you're spending. Your business is to get the best results you can following their wishes. If they want you to build a house upside down standing on its chimney, it's up to you to do it and still get the best possible result." And I think that probably explains the Bronson house. This is an interesting photo. It shows Alexander Agassiz sailing in front of his home Castle Hill. The Bronson house is in the background. It's what's shown in the close-up on the left. I actually bumped into this photo while having lunch at Castle Hill. It was staring at me while I was having a lobster roll. It shows that you can do historical research just about anywhere. The Bronson family lived in the house until 1887. It was then sold to the Hutton family. The Huttons demolished the house in the early 1890s and hired Peabody and Stearns to replace it with a Romanesque revival house known as Shamrock Cliff. Of course, Shamrock Cliff still stands. It's now the Ocean Cliff Hotel. Hunt's design for the Bronson house was not groundbreaking, but for better or worse, it appears to have inspired a couple of other Newport copycats. Here we have the Bronson house on the left. In the center, we have Bleak House. It was built in 1864 for Thomas Winans. It no longer stands. And on the right is the Train Villa, which was built in 1869 for George Train, and it no longer stands. So none of those houses presently exist. Hunt's next project in Newport was the home of Edward Willing. One of the nice things about Newport Lost and Found is it brings together people who really just love digging into history, and one of my fellow collaborators is Adam Keefe. Adam's the fellow who is responsible for the research done on the Willing house. This property has been on an interesting ride. Willing belonged to a wealthy family from Philadelphia. He had a daughter who married John Jacob Astor IV, the fellow who went down with the Titanic 112 years ago. Willing's obit described him as a member of society who, quote unquote, never engaged in any pursuit. Probably not how I'd want to be remembered, but in any event, Willing purchased an existing house on Bellevue in 1860. He then engaged Hunt to do a renovation of the house from 1860 to 1861. This photo shows a later alteration of Hunt's work by the architect George Champlin Mason. But if you look closely, you'll see that the house appears to integrate Hunt's work. Take a look at the area that I highlighted in yellow. It appears to be a Second Empire house with a mansard roof and a projecting bay on the front. Does that sound familiar? Well, it should. It's very similar to what we just saw with the Bronson house. Willing sold the house to a fellow by the name of Loring Andrews in 1871. Andrews then engaged George Champlin Mason to do a stick-style makeover. And this is an 1875 photo of the same structure with the renovation by Mason. Andrews later sold the house to a fellow by the name of Theodore Havemeyer in 1880. Havemeyer renamed it Friedheim. He hired the Mason firm to do a further makeover. That's the house on the left, the photo on the left. The house was later sold to Pembroke Jones in 1903. Jones renamed it Sherwood. He hired Francis Hoppin to do another makeover, and of course that's the photo on the right. So somewhere under all of the later alterations that were made at the house is a Richard Morris Hunt core. Hunt's next project in Newport was the John Griswold house, and this is where Hunt really established himself in Newport. And here's a photo of the house just as construction was ending in 1864. It may be the earliest photo of the house. After Richard met Catherine in 1861, they took an extended honeymoon to Europe. While in Europe, they met John Griswold and his wife, who were vacationing in Paris. Griswold came from a family that had made a fortune in the China trade. Griswold invested that fortune in railroads at the right time. He was a wealthy man, and he looked to Hunt to build a house that reflected his wealth. Hunt worked on a design for the house while he was on his honeymoon, but his wife Catherine loved that. You're in the city of love, and you're working on designs for a house. But in any event, Hunt's design of the Griswold house evolved over several years. This is one of the first iterations. Note the tower, which is somewhat reminiscent of what we saw at the Edward Willing house. That design evolved into this, starting to look a little more like what we recognize as the Griswold house. And that design evolved into this, a more refined sketch with gables and a porte cochere that resembles what stands today. And here's a later watercolor of the design with a cupola that was never actually built. The house was constructed between 1863 and 1864. And here is the final product. This photo is from the 1930s. I could spend the entire hour talking about the Griswold house. In 1860, architecture in America was blocky and symmetric. Most houses were built in either a Second Empire style with a mansard roof or an Italianate style. The Griswold house marks a transition to something very different, less formal and more picturesque. Professor Vincent Scully later coined the term stick style for this form of architecture. This refers to the stickwork on the exterior that's intended to resemble structural half-timbering. There's an excellent article about the Griswold house by Sarah Landau. She wrote, "The Griswold house is far more sophisticated in concept and detailing than other wooden houses of its time in America. Its overhangs and outcroppings are genuinely evocative of the old half-timbered buildings found in many parts of Europe." So you have to ask, where did Hunt get his inspiration for the Griswold house? During his travels in Europe, Hunt had studied and sketched the half-timbered buildings in France, Switzerland, Germany, and England. In 1861, he traveled to England through Normandy. He encountered buildings like this, the Maison Dieu in Saint-Lô, Normandy. This is actually a photo from Hunt's personal collection. You see lots of elements that Hunt integrated into his early work: half-timbering, decorative trusses on the gables, brackets, and so on. The interior of the Griswold house is just as impressive as the exterior. Here we have the Great Hall, a theme that we'll see on a grander scale at Ochre Court and the Breakers. And this is the library. The Griswold family owned the house until 1915, when it was acquired by the Art Association of Newport as its new home. This is a wonderful photo of the early leaders of the Art Association, including Maud Howe Elliott dressed in black. The Art Association also acquired the stable for the Griswold house. The stable was located on the northeast corner of the property. Here's an early photo, courtesy of the Art Museum. And I bet you're wondering whatever happened to that stable. Well, in 1920, the stable was raised, moved, and attached to the east elevation of the main house to create an exhibition space. And how cool is that? That was one of the more interesting discoveries of this project. And of course, this is a photo of the Bellevue facade of the Griswold house. It's remarkably well preserved. If Hunt were walking on Bellevue today, he would instantly recognize it. Hunt's next project in Newport was the chalet. Hunt designed the chalet on Chastellix Ave from 1866 to 1867. The owner was Rebecca Colford Jones. She and her sister Mary were wealthy widows who owned and developed real estate in New York City. Mrs. Colford Jones was the aunt of Edith Wharton, and some suggest that the Jones family was the source of the phrase, "keeping up with the Joneses." True to that motto, Mrs. Colford Jones hired Hunt to build a Swiss-style villa in the hills above Harrison Ave. This is the original design by Hunt, and here's the earliest photo of what was eventually built by Hunt. It's consistent with the original plan, but different from what you would recognize as the building today. There was a renovation of the house in the 1880s. It was probably done by Hunt, but I haven't seen anything conclusive on that. And here's a renovated version of the house with a series of additions. The most well-known occupant in the house was a fellow by the name of Hugh Willoughby. Hugh was an amazing guy. He was an early plane builder and was closely associated with the Wright brothers. He actually kept his biplane at the chalet. Here's a photo of his biplane on the lawn. And here's a photo of Hugh and his family on the front steps of the chalet. Hugh is the fellow who probably hired Hunt to do the 1880s renovation. Thankfully, the house survived a fire in the 1980s, and this is what the chalet looks like today. It's been converted to condos, very thoughtfully done. Hunt also designed the stable and carriage house for the chalet. Here's Hunt's original design, along with an early 1900s photo of the building as constructed. And here's what the building looks like today. It's been converted into a residence. Hunt's next project in Newport was his renovation of Bayside. The house was owned by John Bigelow on Washington Street. Bigelow is a businessman with interests in New York and Boston. This is an 1892 photo of Washington Street from the water. I've circled the Bigelow house and included a close-up. We don't know much about what Bayside originally looked like. We do know that Bigelow hired Hunt to do a renovation of the house from 1867 to 1868. And here's what the house looked like after the renovation. Many thanks to Lisa Stewart for providing this image. There are a couple of interesting stories associated with the house. The Bigelow family was close to the architect Charles McKim. Bigelow's daughter Annie married McKim in 1874. Bigelow's son William was one of McKim's early partners. The firm was then called McKim, Mead and Bigelow. McKim designed the carriage house for Bayside on 2nd Street, but alas, McKim and Annie divorced in 1878. That didn't go over well with William, who left the firm, and that opened the door for a young architect by the name of Stanford White to join the firm, and the rest, as they say, is history. Bayside was also known as the place where the Town and Country Club was founded in 1871. The club was a social gathering of Newport's leading intellectuals to discuss science, history, architecture, and art. The club's members included folks like Julia Ward Howe, George Waring, John Lafarge, Alexander Agassiz, and yes, Richard Morris Hunt. Waring welcomed folks to the first meeting at the Bigelow home with the following words: "In every dining room there are two guests to be entertained, the body and the soul." The club continued on in dining rooms and gardens all around Newport until 1905. Bigelow House was eventually demolished in the 1930s. Here is the site today. The carriage house by McKim on 2nd Street still stands. Hunt's next project in Newport was Villa Lou. Villa Lou is actually just over the border in Middletown. It was built in 1857 by Richard Upjohn for Alexander Van Rensselaer. Van Rensselaer belonged to a wealthy New York family. He had a medical degree, but he never practiced. Instead, he was considered a quote-unquote man of means and leisure. There was a renovation by Hunt from 1867 to 1868. The scope of Hunt's renovation is unclear, but here's an early survey of the house for beautifying country homes. The house was a rectangular block with porches on the front and the back. By 1875, there were bays added to the east and the west. I suspect that Hunt was responsible for the bays. In the early 1900s, the property was sold to Adolphe Audrain, who did further renovation work. He renamed the property Restmere. And here it is today. It still exists as a residence. You can't mention Villa Lou without also mentioning its sister house, Villa Lawn. Villa Lawn was built by Upjohn about a year earlier in 1856 for Hamilton Hoppin. One sister owned Villa Lou while the other owned Villa Lawn. Believe it or not, these are photos of two different houses. Villa Lou on the left and Villa Lawn on the right. You may be wondering why Van Rensselaer gave the job to Hunt rather than to Upjohn, who was still alive and working at the time. Well, Hunt's wife, Catherine, was the sister of Van Rensselaer's wife, so I'm sure that connection had a lot to do with it. Hunt's next project in Newport was Edgerston. Hunt built Edgerston for Lewis Morris Rutherford on Harrison Ave in 1869. I once again have Adam Keefe to thank for his research on this house. There are no known photographs of this house other than this small glimpse of Edgerston in the background of this photo of Beachbound. The house is described in newspaper accounts as 53 by 87, 2 stories with a mansard roof, and that's all I got. Rutherford was a lawyer and an astronomer known for his work with celestial photography. He named the house for the Rutherford ancestral home in Scotland. The house stood until it was purchased by Stuart Duncan in 1911. Duncan demolished the house and hired John Russell Pope to build an English-inspired house, Bonnycrest. And here we have Bonnycrest, which was later converted to condos. Duncan also hired the Olmsted firm to landscape the grounds. On the left is a photo taken by the Olmsted firm from the exact location once occupied by Edgerston. It's roughly where the pool at Bonnycrest is now located, so when next you go for an evening swim at Bonnycrest, look up the stars and think of Mr. Rutherford. Hunt's next project in Newport was Fairlawn. Here we see the house in 1875. Fairlawn was built in the early 1850s by Newport builder and architect Seth Bradford. Bradford had just completed work on Chateau Sur Mer. The house was built for Andrew Ritchie, but it was purchased by Levi Morton in 1868. Morton would later serve as governor of New York and vice president under President Benjamin Harrison. Morton felt that the house was inadequate for entertaining the elites of the political world, and so in 1869, he engaged Hunt to add a ballroom to the southeast corner of the house. On the left is Hunt's design for the ballroom, and on the right is what Hunt actually built. The ballroom was described by the architect George Champlin Mason in his 1875 book, Newport and Its Cottages. Mason wrote, "A few years since, Mr. Morton, wanting more room, added a spacious barroom, connecting it with the drawing room and with entrances also from the lawn. It is elaborately decorated, and the little breaks and corners systematically arranged add to the general effect and afford room for those who are not dancing, but who would watch the dancers in the mazy round of the waltz or gallop. How softly the music steals to us as we step out on the lawn. Ah, fair lawn." Well, doesn't that sound like a fun party? I think Morton got his money's worth with a ballroom. In fact, he entertained President Ulysses Grant in the ballroom in 1870. And here's what the ballroom looked like in 1880. The room was decorated in a neo-Greek style. And here's another photo of the ballroom from 1890. This image was included in Ward McAllister's tell-all book, Society as I Have Found It. The caption reads, "A dinner table of one of the smart set at Newport, Rhode Island." Over the next few years, there were more renovations by some big deal architects, McKimby and White, then Peabody and Stearns. In the early 1880s, McKimby and White designed a second-floor addition above the ballroom for bedrooms, and this is how the house looked in the 1880s. We see the transformation on the right side of the building as shown in this photograph. And this shows the change in the ballroom from Hunt to McKimby and White. The first floor was retained in terms of the interior elements, but the building went up a floor, and there was an expansion of the brick. And if you were to go out there today, this is what the ballroom looks like. It's still there, and it looks very different from what Hunt designed on the interior, but the structure is still there. Then in the early 1890s, Peabody and Stearns did a major renovation. They expanded the house from 2 gables on the front to 3. They added a new porte cochere, and they added a circular porch. The result is what we know today as Fair Lawn. Peabody and Stearns also renovated the interior spaces, including Hunt's ballroom. The ballroom went from neo-Greek to a more fashionable French style. Here's what the ballroom looks like today. It's, again, the same Hunt structure with decorative elements by Peabody and Stearns. So a closer look at some of the decorative elements. And here is a before and after. We've got Hunt on the left and Peabody and Stearns on the right, but it appears to be the same alcove in the ballroom. The house then passed through a number of different hands until it was acquired by Salve Regina in 1997. Hunt's next project in Newport was the Lodge. The Lodge was located on Bellevue between Narragansett and Dixon. It was purchased by Mrs. Elizabeth Underhill Coles in 1869. Mrs. Coles came from a prominent New York family. She was best known as an art collector and philanthropist. Mrs. Coles engaged Hunt to renovate the house from 1869 to 1870. I don't have any photos of the original house, but this is what it looked like after Hunt's renovation. We see Hunt applying the same half-timbered style from the Griswold house. The lodge was demolished around 1900 to make way for Ogden Codman's masterpiece, Villa Rosa. Ironically, Villa Rosa was demolished in 1962. I like to say that the wrecking ball giveth and the wrecking ball taketh away. This is the aftermath. I know what you're thinking. Don't shoot the messenger. Hunt's next project in Newport was his own home, Hilltop Cottage. The house was originally built by Henry Schroeder of Baltimore. It was purchased by William Morris Hunt in 1856. William sold it to his brother Richard in 1864. Richard then renovated the house from 1869 to 1870, adding a new third floor. Hunt lived at Hilltop until his death in 1895. His wife Catherine continued to own Hilltop until her death in 1909. Hunt's heirs then sold the house. It was enlarged and converted to an inn. And this is what the house looked like in its days as an inn. You'll recognize the entrance to the Jewish cemetery on the left. That's the intersection of K and Toro. The house entertained guests for a number of years. Here's a couple of postcard images, probably from postcards given to guests. Over the next 15 years, it was a hot spot in Newport, but apparently not hot enough. It was then sold and demolished in the mid-1920s, replaced by the fanciest new hotel in Newport, the Hotel Viking. On the left is the Hotel Viking during construction, and on the right is the finished product. And as we all know, the Hotel Viking still stands just a short hop away. Hunt's next project in Newport was the William Travers House. This one's a bit complicated. The house was built for Thomas Hitchcock in the early 1860s on Ochre Point Ave. Hunt probably designed it. It does look like Hunt, but there's nothing conclusive on that. We do know that Hunt renovated the house from 1869 to 1872. This is what the house originally looked like. And this is what the house looked like after the renovation. Hunt added a wraparound porch and an addition on the right, probably a ballroom similar to what we saw at Fairlawn. The owner at the time of the renovation was William Travers. Travers made his fortune on Wall Street, but he's better known for his involvement in horse racing. He's the guy responsible for the Travers block on Bellevue. Travers House was purchased by Mary Frick Garrett in 1899. She hired John Russell Pope to build a new house called Whitehome. Pope had attended the École de Beaux Arts like Hunt. Pope could have demolished the Hunt building, but I suspect that he couldn't bring himself to do it. So instead, he creatively built Whitehome in front of the Travers House. Travers House became the service wing for Whitehome. Here's a plan of Whitehome with the Travers House highlighted in yellow. The photo shows the backside of Whitehome with just a small glimpse of the Travers House, again highlighted in yellow. Many thanks to Brian Griffin for his analysis of these images. By the early 1960s, Whitehome had seen better days. Here it is in 1962. It was purchased by Salva Regina in 1963, and they proceeded to demolish it and replace it with a residence hall. Here are photos taken during demolition. And this is all that's left of Whitehome, the line of trees that once led to the entrance. That's on Narragansett Ave. Hunt's next project in Newport involved Chateau Sommer. Here we see the house in 1875. Chateau Sommer was designed by Seth Bradford in the early 1850s. It was originally owned by William Shepherd Wetmore, who made his fortune in the China trade. But the house is perhaps more associated with his son, George Peabody Wetmore, who was later governor of Rhode Island. George inherited the property in 1862 at the age of 16. He eventually hired Hunt to renovate the house in 2 phases. And in order to understand the changes, we need to take a step back to the original version of the house. This photo was taken sometime before 1870. It shows the house as originally built by Bradford. The engraving provides a sense of how the property was laid out. First phase of renovation took place between 1870 and 1873. Here are early renderings by Hunt for the west facade. Hunt eventually implemented something very similar. Hunt raised the roof and rebuilt it in a mansard style. He created a new entrance with a porte cochere, and he added a new tower. That's the condition depicted in the 1875 photo, and that's the way it still looks today. The second phase took place between 1876 and 1880. Hunt raised the dining room and service wings by an additional story on the northeast side. You can see the changes in this 1870s photo as compared to this current photo. You can see that the structure has been raised by an additional floor. Hunt also made dramatic changes to the interior. He was responsible for the central staircase on the left, as well as the Great Hall on the right. And this is Hunt's design for the fireplace in the billiard room, again done in a neo-Greek style. The photos show that the fireplace was built pretty much in accordance with Hunt's design. Hunt also worked with the Italian craftsman Luigi Ferlini for the wood carving in the library and the dining room. This is some of Ferlini's work. We'll see more from Ferlini in a few moments. Hunt also handled the installation of the exterior gates to Chateau Samir. He designed the pillars in a neo-Greek style, kind of like Egyptian obelisks. If you look closely, you'll see that the pillars have a carved bird. It's a falcon, part of the Wetmore coat of arms. The house was owned by the Wetmore family until the late 1960s. It was then sold to the Preservation Society. Hunt's next project in Newport was the Charlotte Cushman House, also known as the Corners. This house stood on the corner, obviously, of Rhode Island Ave and Catherine. Most people associate Hunt with Bellevue Ave, and with good reason, but the small stretch of Catherine Street from Rhode Island Ave to Greenough Place was home to 4 early designs by Hunt, and this was the first. It was designed for Cushman by Hunt from 1870 to 1871. Cushman was a personal friend to Hunt. She was a world-famous actress who performed in theaters across the U.S. and Europe. Hunt used a stick-style approach with a tower and a series of porches and balconies. Here is Hunt's original design for the Cushman house. It doesn't bear much resemblance to what was eventually built. And here's a series of photos showing the house from different angles. There's really a lot going on, and there's a lot of interest, whether you look at the house from Rhode Island Ave or from Catherine Street. And here's an engraving of the house from an 1876 edition of the Art Journal. The house was damaged by fire sometime after 1938 and then demolished. And here's that same corner today. Hunt worked on the renovation of a house called Hypotenuse at around the same time. Here we see Hypotenuse in the 1870s. Hypotenuse was once located on Church Street near Hunt's hilltop property. It was originally built as a small center chimney house in the 18th century. It was renovated in a Greek Revival style in the early 19th century. Hunt purchased the house in 1870. He also purchased a vacant lot on the corner of Catherine and Greenough. Hunt then proceeded to move the house to that lot, siting the house on the diagonal, hence the name Hypotenuse. Hunt renovated the house in a stick style with half timbering and a bonnet gable. Keep that gable in mind. We'll see it again. Hunt never actually lived in the house. Instead, he rented it out to his buddy George Waring for several years. Waring eventually purchased the house in 1881. Waring was a leading engineer in the 19th century. He's the guy who designed the drainage system for Central Park. Waring was also a founding member of the Town and Country Club. He hosted meetings of the club at Hypotenuse with a who's who of 19th century celebs, such as the writer Oscar Wilde. Hypotenuse remains a residence. Here's an 1880s photo, courtesy of the owner. It's an ivy-covered picturesque scene, and the same scene is captured in the engraving. The house hasn't changed much over the years. Here's how the house looked in 1969 and the house today. Hunt designed the Thomas Appleton house while working on Hypotenuse. Hunt was a close friend of Appleton. Appleton came from a wealthy family in the Boston area and considered himself a gentleman artist. His BFF was Longfellow, who married Appleton's sister. Hunt designed the house for Appleton in 1871. This is his design, which was implemented in what was actually built, unlike what we saw with the Cushman house. The design is exuberant stick style with balconies and dormers and brackets. The exterior was a blend of wood shingle and colored slates in geometric patterns. Here's a couple of additional views from the 1890s. The house was significant in its day, so much so that it was the first house depicted in American Architect and Building News. And here's the engraving that was published in 1876. Unfortunately, the Appleton house was destroyed by fire in the 1920s, and the land was added to the adjacent Ayrault house. The Ayrault house was built by Cross and Cross in 1915, and it still stands on Catherine Street. The last house on our tour of Catherine Street is the John Richardson house. It was designed by Hunt for Richardson between 1870 and 1872. I know next to nothing about Richardson other than he was a bachelor who wanted a summer place in Newport. The house is a quirky blend of stick style and Second Empire. We've got half timbering, we've got a tower, we've got a mansard roof. I suspect that Richardson was steering the boat on this one. The house was eventually sold to Sophia Blatchford. She hired the architect William Ralph Emerson to enlarge and renovate the house in 1885. Here's the final product, a rambling shingle-style house. It looks nothing like the Hunt structure, but I do think we see Hunt's work in the double windows on the second floor. The house has been converted to apartments, and here it is today. Okay, let's move on from Catherine Street. Hunt was involved in a project for Richard Baker in 1870. The house was called Westcliff. It was located on the cliff walk overlooking Bailey's Beach. The house was originally built in the 1850s for Charles Mixter. This photo shows the Mixter house. Baker purchased the house in 1867. Baker was a partner in a Boston shipping firm. He engaged Hunt to renovate the house, and you guessed it, stick style. And here's what the house looked like after the renovation. Hunt's design included a steeply pitched tower, which foreshadows some of his later Beaux Arts work. And here's a series of photos showing the house from different angles. The house was prominently located on the cliff walk, so it found its way into lots of 19th century photos. I'll share just a couple. The first photo is seaweed and Westcliff. Second photo is Westcliff and breakwater, also known as Lippett's Castle. Westcliff was pulled down in the late 1920s to make way for a replacement. The site is now occupied by a Norman-style house called Plaisance. So, as you can tell, this was a busy time for Hunt, but he somehow managed to fit in a commercial project on Bellevue, the Travers Block. This project involved his old client, William Travers. The area was an up-and-coming business district between Atlantic House to the north and Ocean House to the south. This is a photo of Bellevue taken in the 1860s before the Travers Block was built. We see a wooded lot with Ocean House in the distance. Keep in mind that wooded lot. In 1870, Travers hired Hunt to create something to meet the increased demand for retail space. Hunt designed the building that would have looked perfectly at home in a medieval village. It's a brick structure with half timbering and a mansard roof. The roof is broken up by multiple gables with decorative trusses. And you'll notice that there's no casino building on the right. That would come 10 years later. Didn't take long for the Travers Block to establish its presence on Bellevue. It became a magnet for commercial activity. This photo captures the hustle and bustle of daily life on Bellevue. And here's a few more, complete with horses, buggies, bicycles, and pedestrians. And here's the building 100 years later in 1971. The 1971 photos were taken as part of the HAB survey, the Historic American Building Survey. The timing was perfect to document what the building looked like, because a few months later, in 1972, the building was hit by fire. The result was catastrophic damage to the upper floors. But the owner was able to use photos of the house as it originally existed, as well as the HAB survey, to restore the building, and today it looks pretty much the way Hunt originally designed it. Hunt's next project in Newport was actually over the border in Middletown. This is Marie Mont on Green End Ave, an area known as Honeyman Hill. In 1871, Charles Haywood hired Hunt to build him a summer home. Haywood was a surgeon at Mass General Hospital in Boston. This is Hunt's design for Marie Mont. The house was a stick-style design with a jerkin-head roof. And here's what the completed house looked like. This image is from an 1893 edition of Record and Guide. Many thanks to Adam Keefe for locating it. The house went through a couple of owners until it was purchased by Thomas Emery as a gift for his wife Mary in 1901. The Emerys are the folks who named the house Marie Mont, combining the French words for Mary and Hill. The Emorys then embarked on a major renovation of the house, replacing the stick-style elements with something more shingle-style. And this is the renovated house. It appears that local builder and architect J.D. Johnston was involved in the renovation. Mary occupied the house until her death in 1927. It then passed through several owners before being converted to condos, and here's the house today. Hunt's next project in Newport was Hilltop, not Hunt's house, but a different Hilltop, this one on Ruggles. Hunt was engaged by Theodore Finney to build the house from 1871 to 1872. Finney came from a wealthy family with sugar and coffee plantations in Cuba. Hunt designed the house in a basic stick style with half timbering, a series of bay projections, and bracketed porches. This is an 1870s photo of the house. A few years later, Finney hired William Ralph Emerson to renovate the house in a Romanesque revival style. And Emerson used less wood, more stone. Here's the house today. You can still see remnants of Hunt's work in the profile of the hillside facade and the half timbering on the first floor. Hilltop is still a residence. Hunt's next project in Newport was Linden Gate. Of all the houses lost in Newport, this one probably pains me the most. Hunt designed Linden Gate from 1871 to 1872 for Henry Marquand at the corner of Old Beach and Rhode Island Ave. Marquand made his millions in real estate, banking, and railroads. He was also an art collector and a founder of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Marquand had all of his art, needed some place to put it, so he turned to his close friend Hunt. This was the first of several projects that Hunt handled from Marquand, including his house in New York City, a chapel at Princeton, and the family tomb at Island Cemetery. They were friends to the end. Marquand was actually a pallbearer at Hunt's funeral. The level of detail in Linden Gate is breathtaking. Here's a couple of additional views of the house from the 1890s. It's a picturesque massing of stone, brick, and wooden decorative elements. Do you wonder where Hunt got his inspiration for Linden Gate? Some say it was probably here. This is a drawing of the Villa End in Berlin. It was designed by architect Hermann End for his personal home in 1864. It's likely that Hunt was aware of the drawing, which was published in 1869. Could be that he actually saw the house in his travels. You see a lot of similarities in the rustic character of the house with the prominent gable and the decorative trusses. The interior of Linden Gate was also a masterpiece with decorative work by Luigi Ferlini and John Lafarge. This was the reception room in the 1880s. And this was the dining room. I think you can see why neighbors refer to the house as Bric-a-Brac Hall. The house was still standing in 1969. Here's a photo taken for the HAB survey. Here's a few more, focusing on some of the more prominent architectural features. The photos are a real treasure because, unfortunately, Linden Gate was lost to fire in 1973. I suspect that some in the audience will remember the event. But the carriage house and stable still exists. On the left is how it originally looked, and on the right is how it looks today. The stable was relocated on the property and it's been converted to condos. The Porter's Lodge on Gibbs also survives. You can see it in the background of this photo. And this is the Porter's Lodge today. Hunt's next project in Newport was the Bruin Villa on Howe Ave. The house was originally built in the early 1850s by Seth Bradford, the same fellow who built Chateau Sommer in Fairlawn. The owner was Mary Bruin, widow from a wealthy New York City family. Bradford designed the house as a stone box with Italianate accents. These photos show the house in the 1860s. And here's a few more. Folks enjoying summer in Newport. Bruin hired Hunt in 1872 to renovate the house. Hunt had a very creative approach. He took the basic stone structure and wrapped it in an application of stick style. The original house disappears under a picturesque assembly of stickwork, balconies, and gables. And here's the house today. The house still stands as condos. So let me ask, does the gable look familiar? Well, it should. Hunt seems to have taken his design for the bonnet gable at Hypotenuse and applied it to the Bruin Villa. The last residential project that we'll be talking about is Le Chalet on Bellevue. On the left is Hunt's 1872 design for Le Chalet. The house was built on spec for Hunt's old client, John Griswold. On completion, the house was sold to Anna Gibert, the widow of a wealthy doctor from New York City. The original design was mature stick style with half timbering, balconies, bracketed porches, and iron cresting on the roof. All of these details would have been pricey, so Griswold decided to scale back on construction. Hunt didn't build the balconies and he didn't install the cresting. Those details had to wait until 2010. The new owner restored the house in a way that implemented Hunt's original vision. And for those efforts, they were recognized by the Newport Restoration Foundation in 2012. I think Hunt would be proud. As an aside, before buying the breakers, Cornelius Vanderbilt II rented Le Chalet, so the owner should probably put up a Cornelius slept here sign. So, that's all of the houses that fall within this period, but we're not quite done yet. Hunt was often called upon to work on private memorials and public monuments over his career. This includes the pedestal for the Statue of Liberty, but long before that, he worked on 3 monuments in Newport before 1875. The first was a memorial for Carolyn Helen Russell in Island Cemetery. Carolyn was one of Catherine Hunt's sisters. She died in 1863, and her husband hired Hunt to design her memorial. On the left is Hunt's drawing for the memorial. The final product looked very different, a full sarcophagus made of black granite. The next one you should be familiar with, the monument in honor of Commodore Matthew Perry in Toro Park. Hunt worked with John Quincy Adams Ward on the project. Ward was the leading sculptor in America in the mid-1800s. Hunt and Ward were close friends. In fact, Hunt designed Ward's house and studio in New York City. Hunt worked on the pedestal while Ward sculpted the bronze, which is typically what they did. That was 1868. There's actually an excellent chapter in one of Jim Egan's books on the memorial, and I saw Jim here earlier today. Hunt's next memorial was designed for the Wetmore family plot at Island Cemetery. It was installed in 1873. Hunt was working at Chateau sur Mer at the time, so it was probably done as part of the same commission, a 2-for-1 deal. So, we've been talking about the projects that Hunt completed in Newport, but there was one project that thankfully never actually happened. This is Hunt's design for a renovation of the Redwood Library. As we all know, the Redwood was designed by Peter Harrison in the 1740s. There was an addition by George Snell in the 1850s. But by the 1860s, the Redwood was running out of room for its collection of books and artwork. A committee was formed to decide what should be done. The committee included Charles Howland Russell and Hamilton Hoppin, who were both brothers-in-law to Hunt. So how's that for packing the jury? Hunt was asked to provide plans for the renovation, and this is what he put together: a series of interconnected pavilions located beside and behind the existing Redwood. Hunt got the contract, shocker, and then things blew up. Folks in Newport hated Hunt's design. They felt that it overshadowed the simplicity of Harrison's original building. A number of prominent members of the Redwood Board of Directors resigned in protest, including the local architect George Champlin Mason. Eventually, cooler heads prevailed. The board voted to rescind the contract to Hunt, and George Champlin Mason got the job. He designed what's now the main entrance to the Redwood, and I think we all have to agree that it does a better job of harmonizing with Harrison's original building than the Hunt design. So, let's fast forward. It's 1874. Hunt is exhausted, and he's battling illness. His doctor tells him to take a break. So Hunt and his wife leave Newport and spend the next 12 months traveling in Europe. Hunt's biographer, Paul Baker, writes, "Once again, Hunt would find his inspiration renewed by the art and architecture of the old world. When he returned home, he was to move in new directions in his work." And this acts as a divider for Hunt's career. When Hunt returns from Europe, his work looks dramatically different. This is the Petit Chateau, the modest house that he designed for William and Alva Vanderbilt in New York City in the late 1870s, early 1880s. It was a statement house, and it foreshadowed what came next, the big Beaux Arts houses that established Hunt as the leading architect of his time. The Petit Chateau was demolished in 1926, but the sculpture that topped the chateau was salvaged and moved to the Eagle's Nest estate on Long Island. Here it is at Eagle's Nest. Does the sculpture look familiar? It's none other than Richard Morris Hunt dressed as a stonemason. And we saw a plaster cast of that same sculpture in Hunt's Newport studio circa 1890. So, to bring it all together, there are two very different periods in Hunt's career, but even in Hunt's later work, we see peaks of his early creativity. We see echoes of the roofline from the Baker House in his design at Ochre Court, and we see echoes of the Great Hall from the Griswold House in his design at both Ochre Court and the Breakers. Hunt was hard at work until the end. He died in 1895 at Hilltop Cottage, just as he had completed work on the Breakers. It was very much at the height of his career. After his death, Hunt was recognized as the greatest American architect of his time. This is his memorial in New York City by the architect Bruce Price and the sculptor Daniel Chester French. He and Catherine are buried at Island Cemetery in Newport. His simple granite slab reads, "Laborare est orare," to work is to pray. But memories are short. With time, Hunt's reputation took a hit. His stone palaces came to be viewed as white elephants, as symbols of Gilded Age excess. He was referred to as the Chateau builder to Fifth Avenue, the Beaux Arts copyist, and the Vanderbilt architect, and not in a good way. But the tides have shifted. Hunt is now revered for his Beaux Arts work, while his earlier work is somewhat forgotten. That's not what Hunt wanted. So I hope that tonight's presentation is a reminder that Hunt did some incredible work in Newport long before the Breakers.